Hello, and welcome to the second of these lectures from my home. This one is on the topic of one of our favorite philosophers in the United States of America, Karl Marx. Um, this lecture, like the last one on Hegel, is going to be a lecture that follows along the handout of on Marx that is available to you on Learning Suite. So you can think of that handout as a set of lecture notes, fairly detailed lecture notes, with the lecture filling in some of additional detail on the topic. So here we are talking in the great free state of the United States of America, talking about a fellow who is perhaps our arch enemy, philosophical arch enemy, or at least we used to think of him in this way, Karl Marx. When I was an undergraduate, I studied political science and international relations in the 1980s. And in those days, we studied a lot of Karl Marx. I remember that I had classes on Das Kapital. I had classes on radical economics. I had classes on political philosophy, in which we were reading Peter Singer's little book about Marx. I had a separate class on Marx himself. We got a lot of. I had a class on a class from economics called Capitalism and Socialism, which went over the specific ways in which the old Soviet Union had tried to establish a bureaucratic entity for establishing prices, since they were not going to allow prices to be established by the laws of supply and demand. We got a lot of Karl Marx in those days. And the reason, I think, is quite clear. We studied a lot of Karl Marx with the idea that we were trying to get to know our enemy. And this is something of an alien idea, I think, to young college students these days. We were very much afraid of the Russians. And here's why. They had nuclear missiles aimed at us. And not just nuclear missiles, they had nuclear missiles that are ICBMs with these things called MIRVs, which are multiple re-entry vehicles. So the nuclear missile goes up into outer space, and then it shoots down an umbrella of nuclear bombs that explode all over the place. So, I mean, it was feasible that they could just annihilate every square inch of the United States of America with their ICBMs. We used to talk about how we could prevent having the Soviet Union destroy us through something called MAD, which really is a kind of madness. MAD is mutually assured destruction. We are going to be able to save ourselves because we know that if anybody makes the first move, that the other side is going to retaliate immediately. And so if Russia annihilates every square inch of the United States, we too are going to, in our turn, annihilate every square inch of the Soviet Union, or at least as much as our ICBMs can manage to bring under the destructive umbrella. And then the 80s came to a close, and the 80s closed with the fall of the eastern satellite nations of the Soviet Union. And we were watching on the evening news, and all of a sudden there was a stream of refugees from East Germany and from Hungary that were making their way through Yugoslavia and into Austria. And then the stream became very large, and then we knew that something was going on. And before very long, what we had was a situation in which those satellite nations simply devolved out of the Soviet sphere. And there we were watching, and everybody is just astonished that the Berlin Wall comes down. It is a time period in which we are very excited. The philosophies that we associate with Karl Marx seem to have been completely falsified, and we were right, and we were better. And now Karl Marx, may he rest in peace, buried in England, by the way, I believe. We don't need to worry much about him anymore. And at the end of that era, Karl Marx sort of dramatically faded away from our consciousness. We were no longer concerned. And to some extent, well, I think it's more than to some extent. I think that most Americans, as it says on the handout, think that Marx must be the most superannuated of all philosophers, the most irrelevant, the most obsolete of all philosophers. So why in the world would we study this guy? Even the ancient philosophers are more relevant than Marx. This unfortunate attitude, I'm just going to read this off the handout. This unfortunate attitude, however, understandable, prevents us from seeing that, in fact, there is value and insight to some of the things that Marx has to say. He has something to teach us. And in spite of the fact that we think that Marx has died in the culture, in the culture of Western civilization, this, I think, is just not true. That Marx still continues to be part of the cultural conversation. Here's something to think about. Interestingly, this is a biographical ad hominem note. Karl Marx is one of those very rare bird philosophers who manages to obtain and retain a happy family life. He marries a noble woman, and they live out their lives in a very happy fashion, and that is almost pathological among the philosophical crowd. If we're looking for people who are philosophers, let's say the top tier we'll say are just the ones that happen to make it into history of philosophy textbooks, let's say. Marx is there. And if we're looking for another one who has a happy family life, we're going to have to look pretty hard. But here's one, George Berkeley. Berkeley, too, is one of those people who shares in a kind of domestic bliss. Marx enters the world of the intelligentsia, it says on the handout, as one of this group of people who is very much enamored of Hegel. I think that Marx begins his studies at Jena University, and Hegel has been there. Marx is never at a place where Hegel is at the same time. Their lives do overlap, I think, but it's not the case that they ever encounter each other, I believe. Marx is then going to, I think mostly Marx is a kind of drunken rabble-rouser at Jena, and he's going to end up going to one of Hegel's other schools, that is to Berlin. And he's going to study there, and he is going to be brought up in the ways of Hegel. And to the end, I think we're going to see that Hegelian influence on Marx. However, we also have to think of Marx as being heavily reactionary to the position of Hegel. And in fact, Marx says he is turning Hegel upside down. And I suppose that is somewhat true. Nevertheless, there are some concepts that Marx borrows from Hegel's work, and these are going to be crucial. One of these is Marx is going to be he's going to have a dialectical understanding of history. There's no question that he's picking that up from Hegel. He's going to reconceptualize it in such a way that he's going to strip it of the old spiritual mumbo jumbo that Hegel had been talking about, and he is going to apply relations of production understandings to that dialectical patterning, but nevertheless the pattern is going to remain the same, and it will be his historically explanatory mechanism for getting us to see how history is driving towards some end time. And for Marx, that end time is going to be the ultimate goal of humanity, which is to return to where we had been before, which is in communism. He is also going to borrow from Hegel another couple of ideas that that constitute a good part of Hegel's ethics. We have to say, though, that Marx, and this is an important evaluation of Marx downplays ethics. And he downplays ethics for a straightforward and easily discernible reason, and that is he is going to be taking the ideas that he's getting from Hegel and from elsewhere, we might add, and he is going to understand them through the lens of scientific analysis. Marx is making a claim that his theory is utterly scientific, and that what we need to do is think more scientifically about these things. That leaves very much less room for concerns about justice, for instance. And I'm not sure that there really is, at the end of the day, any genuine concept of justice in Marx. So he does say, as a kind of a matter of, I guess, objectivity, that he thinks that the upper classes, the capitalist class, is exploiting the lower classes, the working classes. But I don't think that Marx really is going to be able to make the claim that it's unjust for the capitalist class to do that. In fact, I think that Marx is going to be very frank in telling us that it's necessary for the capitalists to engage in that kind of conduct, and it's also very necessary for the proletariat, the working classes, to engage in violence, in a violent overthrow of that of the capitalist class. There isn't a big concern with ethics, and I don't think that is usually the way that we see Marx presented. In fact, I think that there is a kind of ethical, veneer in Marx's writings, where we're going to appeal to the moral sensibilities of people, but that is to simply persuade them to get on board with where history is deterministically driving us anyway. We don't really have a kind of story about how it is wrong for the capitalists to behave in the manner that they do. In fact, if we could keep them from acting in the manner that we do, it would seem like we delay the inevitable progress of history. They must act that way. We really want them to act that way, so that we can ultimately get the working class to become conscious of their own position and then take action to overthrow them so that we can get on with the serious business of moving history forward. There are a couple of concepts, though, that are essentially ethical for Hegel that Marx appropriates. One of these is alienation. And I think that we have to understand this concept of alienation as a kind of holdover ethical concept, even from Marx. And that is an idea that when we're alienated, we separate ourselves, our lives, from things that are rightly associated with our lives. And that we ought not to do this, that this is damaging in some way or other to our human natures. Most especially, Marx is concerned with alienation in labor. Marx is a great philosopher of work. His idea is that work is a human-making activity. There, I guess, are some other animals that engage in kinds of work, beavers, for instance. But Marx really thinks that it is an essential characteristic to humanity, and that it's in some way alienating to a worker to be separated from the products of her labor. But it's also alienating to the capitalist to accumulate a bunch of money that is independent of any labor whatsoever. This also is alienating of human nature. And so ultimately, the relations of capitalism are going to be detrimental to both parties. They are going to be detrimental in that they are alienating to the natures of both the worker and the capitalist. And the only way that you can deal with a situation where the relations themselves lead to alienation within the parties that constitute the relation is to somehow change the structure of relations. And Marx thinks that has to be done through a revolution. The other concept that is an ethical concept, I don't think it really is an ethical concept in Marx, but it is for Hegel, and that is something called false consciousness. And here's the way that Marx is going to end up using this notion of false consciousness. False consciousness is to think things, to perceive that things are really structured in some way when they're not structured that way at all. The way that Marx is going to use that is he's going to understand crucially that false consciousness is going to somehow keep the working class from overthrowing the capitalist class when it would be in their best interest to do so. And the way that is going to come about happening is that the working class is going to take as their own interests the interests of the capitalist class. And there's a whole structure of society that is going to reinforce this consciousness among the working class. And so the idea of false consciousness then is going to be something that is going to keep the workers from taking the right kind of action that is going to lead to their ultimate benefit, and that is going to drive history forward. Marx thinks that we can do something about false consciousness. We may be able to raise people's awareness so that they become aware that they are relating to the wrong kinds of things. So Marx starts out as a Hegelian, and he adopts certain Hegelian principles. However, he thinks that Hegel is a kind of occultist. Hegel has all these spiritual views that there is this absolute, a kind of world soul, a consciousness, a cosmic consciousness that is working out its own self-consciousness, kind of God who is somewhat in the dark about where the end of things is going. However, the God will be better off if he reads Hegel. But Marx doesn't go along with much of that stuff. Marx is of the opinion that we need to understand that history really does have this patterning that Hegel has ingeniously discovered, but nevertheless, we have to get rid of all that kind of idealism in the German and the British sense, in which there is nothing but idea or spirit. There is nothing but spiritual minds that have ideas. We need to get rid of all that and recognize that what counts for human beings is economic production and distribution. And Marx refers to this as materialism. Now, keep in mind that when we refer to materialism in general in philosophy, it means this: everything is made out of matter. Hence, materialism. Everything is made out of matter. That's not what Marx has in mind with materialism. Marx recognizes that there is a world that is made out of matter that's out there. But what's important for him is the human interactions, the social interactions with this material world. How is it that humans interact? How do humans interact with this material world to produce items that are necessary for their living and their well-being? All those are economic questions. And then, in addition to the economic question about how do we produce those things, there's the additional economic question about how, once these things are produced, what's the best way of getting them out to everybody? And that is a matter of economic distribution. What's the best way of doing that? And Marx thinks that history is completely driven by concerns mostly with how we go about in our time period interacting with the material world and making products for our own lives to go forward. He thinks that there are different stages of human history. There are 7 of these stages, if I've got them counted up right. There are 3 historical stages. That is, stages that exist or have existed in past states of human affairs. There is one presently existing state, and then there are 2 future states. So is that 7? That is 3, 4, 5. I guess there are 6 stages rather than 7 stages. And here's what they are. First of all, there is a stage of human interactions with the material world in which there is a primitive communism. There is no ownership of the world. There is communal ownership of the stuff within the boundaries of the communal actions. But this does give way to a regime of property. Oh, I should say a little bit more about the primitive communism. There are lots of people who believe this, and you don't have to be a communist to believe this. John Locke holds the same view. And not only John Locke, but others of the early modern natural law theorists. Remember that there is the contrary view that property rights are established by God, and so God designates portions of the world that are going to belong to this person or this person. And those are passed down by primogeniture. This is the position of Sir John Filmer, and that is the position that John Locke is reacting to. And on his account, that leaves the King of England, the old Filmer's view leaves the King of England being the ultimate owner of everything that is in England. We do have a doctrine of eminent domain, but we do have below that notion of eminent domain this idea that there are property usages and that those are fairly sacrosanct, and that the eminent domain can only be used in rare circumstances. Locke is going to establish a property regime, but he doesn't start out in saying that the world is owned by any one individual. It is owned by everybody in common. And Marx is picking up on that view. Marx is sharing that view that, in fact, the world is owned by everybody in common. However, property does come about, and how it comes about is, I guess, anybody's guess. He is not suggesting any sort of biblical account in the way that Locke does. He's got a kind of anthropological account. And I suppose that we would have to say something like, and his anthropology is not all that bad. How does property come about? Not as a matter of principle, but as a matter of history? Well, probably it comes about because we figure out together how to do agriculture. And once we figured out how to do agriculture, we recognize that I don't want to be doing work on land where I'm not going to get the harvest, or something along those lines. And so agriculture leads to property. It leads to, irrigation. It leads to writing. And it also leads, according to Karl Marx, and I'm not sure how plausible this is, but this is the story that he's saying. It also leads to slavery. And that is the first of the stages of history in which we have an internal conflict among the folks who are involved. The next stage of history after slavery is feudalism, and we have to say a little bit about feudalism. Feudalism is, I guess, really the political system of the Middle Ages, and what we really have in mind is not feudalism per se, but something that is the economic system that we can refer to as manneralism. Feudalism as a political system says there is a central leader, a king of some kind, and he doesn't really have the ability to do much by way of administering all the places that are under his control, and so he's going to turn that over to some sub-kings, let's say, and they owe allegiance to this main king, and in turn he is going to allow them to have political power within those areas. That's not what Marx is specifically interested in. What he is interested in is this economic system, which is a very interesting economic system. It is the idea that you have a manor, which is a central residence, let's say, a kind of communal residence of a group of people who are the local nobles, and they are going to own all the surrounding land. What's interesting about the manor is that it is thought to be completely self-sufficient, and you can make a self-sufficient small regime like this when you don't want very much stuff. There is, food, and the noble class is going to have a few luxuries. Um, but really, there's not much by way of desire satisfaction that you're going to find in among either the nobles or the other class in manneralism. And so you can have a completely, apparently, self-sufficient small group. And Marx thinks that that is going to give way, and that has given way, to the present system, which is capitalism. And capitalism will in turn give way to something called socialism. Socialism for Marx is is stipulated as the workers owning the means of production. We tend to think of socialism as having a state component, and I think that's right, and that comes from Marx. Under a regime of socialism, we're going to have the workers owning the means of production through the instrument of the state. But Marx, unlike Hegel, thinks that the state is a alienating institution and influence. And so what he thinks is that this can't be the end of history, having socialism, because we have a system in which we still have an internal tension. Because it operates under the guise of the state, and the state itself is not allowing people to achieve their highest form of human nature. So Marx thinks that ultimately the state will fade out, and we will have some ideal kind of end times in which we are brought back to our beginnings, in which we completely do away with property and the state. And we have a completely classless society in which we are all relatively fulfilled, or more than relatively, we're all really dynamically fulfilled in our lives in doing whatever it is that satisfies us. So those are the various stages of the world, and they are driven forward dialectically. And what I mean by that is that if we go back to the previous stage in history, which is feudalism, Marx is giving us a story about how this program of economic relations and distributions arose out of something of the past, from the past, namely out of feudalism. And here's how that story goes. Under feudalism, we've got two classes. We've got the class of people who own the land, the noble class. They don't do work, but they do own the land. And not only do they own the land, but they own the serfs who are bound to the land. That's what serfs are. They are bound to the land. They never leave the land to which they are bound. They stay on that land from the time they're born till the time that they die. And when there is a transfer of the land transfer includes the transfer of this number of serfs to the party who is now acquiring the land. We might think of this as a form of slavery. It's not like American-style slavery, which we refer to as chattel slavery. But what's the difference between the serf as a slave and a slave in the American South during the antebellum period? Well, these slaves are certainly property elements. They're bought and sold, and they certainly do the labor that is going to be to the benefit of the landowner. Those features, I think, are the same between the two. But the chattel slave is a slave that is, we might think of that slave as being like chattel property, as opposed to real property. Serfs are like real property. That is, they are bound to the earth. They are You can't move them about. Chattel slaves, you can move them about, and that has the potential of being extraordinarily more damaging to the slave than it does to the serf, because what that means is that you can split up families. You can sell off a husband or a wife or children, and this was routinely done. Under serfdom, you are bound to the land, but so are your children, and so is your husband. You guys are all bound to the land together, and so the institution of serfdom keeps the family together. So you've got these two groups of people. You've got serfs and you've got nobles, and by an ancient law that goes all the way back to Roman times, if you have a serf and that serf runs away and manages to stay alive off of the manor for a year, then the status of that former serf now becomes what we call a freeman. That person has become a freeman. And it's important to realize that the role of a freeman, the social class role of a freeman, is somewhat in between that of a serf and that of a noble. It's a middle class, a middling class between the two. What is it that these freemen are going to do? They're going to go to the city, the newly emerging cities, and try to apply their trade. So they gather together in these newly emerging cities and stay away from the old operations on the manor. And it's important as a matter of history to realize that, well, at least to this point, Marx probably gets it right. And that is that the city urban development rises together simultaneously with capitalism. Capitalism is an urban development. So these folks are now living in the cities. They formerly lived on the manor, and now they're in the city. And what are they going to do? Well, here's some things that they can do. They can apply their skills. Some of them are going to be able to apply their skills and organize new businesses. But lots of these guys who are former serfs and who are simply trying to stay alive when they come off of the manor for a year are going to have nothing else to offer but their own labor. And so those guys are going to go to work for the guys who are at a higher skill level. Now we've got a middling class, the freemen, in between that of the serfs and the nobles. They don't own land, so to speak, nor are they bound to the land, but instead they kind of move freely about and eke out a living as best they can. But this middling class, this middle class of freemen now splits into two new classes. One class of the people who begin to acquire some property. The property that is associated with the factory, so to speak. I, squat here and I set up a tanning pit. I've got the raw materials and the property items that are going to help me to be able to tan hides. But I don't want to do that work because it's gross. What I want to do is own the pit and the tools, and then have some of these new guys that are coming off of the manor who are wanting to sell their labor. I want them to tan the hides. And so I'm going to go in the back office and I'm going to set up shop. I'm going to build me a desk in my office and set me up a telephone, and then I'm going to put some papers on it. I'm going to move them around while I've got a bunch of guys out there who are going to be doing the hard business of tanning hides. How do I give them money? Well, Marx thinks, so this is how he thinks that capitalism emerges. He thinks that it emerges dialectically out of this process. How is it that I'm going to distribute money to those guys? Well, Marx is an adherent to what we call the labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value is something that he is not inventing. He's picked it up from classical economists, from David Ricardo and from Adam Smith. We have to be careful in ascribing it too powerfully to David Ricardo. But I think that we can be pretty confident that it is a position held by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. It's also held by John Locke. And it may actually be a kind of old medieval doctrine. But in any case, Locke seems to have some version of it in the Second Treatise of Government. And so Marx picks up on this idea that value is added to a commodity only because people do work to it. Now, we're of the opinion, no, it's by supply and demand. Money value is the only value. And Marx doesn't quite hold that view. He thinks that there is a kind of intrinsic value. In this way, he is perhaps closer to Middle Ages economics than he is to that of our own time. The intrinsic value of a commodity is the value that it has in performing a social action, and he thinks that that is not subject to the variations and fluctuations of supply and demand. Now, remember that I had said that the Soviet Union used to hire an entire centralized bureaucratic organization to work out how to establish prices, because we don't want to do it based on supply and demand. This is an idea that is being carried forward from Marx. That idea is that there is a social value to things, and that social value is distorted under conditions of supply and demand. So prices ought not to be set in that kind of way. And we ought to have somebody who knows what the social value is of each of these things, and then they will set the price. I will be honest with you, I think that way of price establishment is an absolute disaster. It was never able to come to any effective way of distributing things in even a reasonably remotely rational fashion. So while we would, understand the social value of, say, wingnuts, we must say, are indeed very important for the social operations of human beings. But we'll have billions and billions of these wingnuts in excess of anything that people are doing with them. They're just being stockpiled. That's not going to keep us from making more and more and more of them, because every one that we expend our labor on is itself intrinsically valuable in terms of its social application. Meanwhile, we're going to allow shortages to grow of, say, pepperoni or sausages of whatever kind is your favorite, and bread. So we will have billions too many wingnuts, but we will have people waiting in line all day long to get a sausage and a loaf of bread. And this is the sort of thing that I think we're bound to expect from any kind of a situation in which we're going to do away with supply and demand as a price establisher. Marx, though, does think along the same lines of Locke. Locke thinks that 90% plus of the value of a commodity is supplied by the labor that somebody infuses that commodity with. Now, Marx is going to go in a little bit different direction with this than Locke does, of course. What Marx is going to suggest is, under capitalism, Remember our guy who owns the pit, the tanning pits. Under capitalism, he's not going to be doing any of the work. Or let's say that Marx, of course, is going to disagree with the idea that we ought to have a kind of hierarchy of laborers so that one person doesn't do any work except for supervising, telling the others what to do. He's going to be of the opinion that there has to be some organization, of course, but that organization is going to be essentially democratically worked out by the people who know what they're doing in the process of doing the job. If we want to know who's going to be able to make the best decision, the decision ought to be made by the people who are very familiar with the activity and not by somebody who's been trained in, some way of motivating people to do the work without themselves doing that work. So we've got our tanning pit, and we say that this guy by squatter's right has established a kind of land ownership of the pits and some kind of a chattel ownership of the various instruments that are used for tanning. He's going to use that, those little advantages, to bring about a situation where he's going to make a lot of money. Property, Marx thinks, is the very thing that allows him to make that money. What does that mean? That means the guy is going to say, look, I own the pits. You guys can come here and work for a wage that I will tell you. I will tell you what that wage is going to be. I'll pay it to you or not. There is a surplus of people who want to get in and hold a job here, but I am going to pay you a wage, and that wage is going to be such that I am going to have you add value, because remember, value only comes from labor. You are going to add value to this thing that we're making, namely a leather hide. And in fact, you add all of the value, but I am not going to give you or the workers collectively back all the value that you've put into making this product. I'm going to take some of that value and keep it for me. And I'm going to give you back some, but certainly not the level that you have put in. And we call the difference between the total amount of value that a set of workers puts into a product and that which they collectively get back, we call the difference between those two surplus value. And that surplus value goes to the capitalist. And the capitalist is going to use property and that surplus value to establish a kind of sense of power and priority for her position or his position over that of the laborers. Now, why don't the laborers rise up and say, let's just take the pits from this guy and we'll split up all of the value that we get from tanning these hides? And Marx's answer to that is, if they recognize what their interests really were, they would, in fact, overthrow the capitalists. And that's exactly what we want, is we want them to overthrow the capitalists. There is a reason, though, why they don't overthrow the capitalists. And that is that the entire structure of society has been set up to reinforce the interests of the capitalists as opposed to the interests of the workers. In other words, the workers grow up thinking of interests in terms of the interests of the capitalists rather than in terms of their own interests. Marx refers to this, using Hegel's terminology, as false consciousness. And he thinks that the differential between what workers are getting back as opposed to the value that they are putting into commodities has reached a point of crisis. So he thinks that capitalism in his day is, right on the brink of dying. what is it that keeps it from actually dying? And that is, the workers won't overthrow the capitalists because they are relating to the capitalist interests. Marx then sees his position as being legitimately able to advance the position that the workers ought to be made more aware of what their own interests are. And if they drop their false consciousness, they will come to a realization that their consciousness, that their interests lie in overthrowing the capitalists and having the workers own the means of production. And so, in this way, we move from capitalism to the next stage, which is socialism. The workers are going to take over the state. They're going to use the state to reinforce their newly found position of maintaining the relations of production. So that's Marx. Thank you.